Okay, everyone, welcome back to this presentation on the ancient Ethnostate by Guillaume de Rocher. In the first part, we discussed the foundational myths of the Iliad and the Odyssey. And in this part, we will be talking about how those foundations served to quite literally build Hellenic society and how those foundations manifested themselves in Hellenic society in the real world. Now, keep in mind that this isn't so much a book review as it is an exploration of some of the themes and ideas which de Rocher presents in his book. Whether he presents them intentionally, explicitly, or implicitly, or not, these are just sort of some of my thoughts that I took away from reading his book. So keep that in mind. And our guide for this video is going to be Herodotus, just as Herodotus is the primary source that de Rocher relies upon for a chunk of his book. Now, Herodotus, if you don't know, is often considered the father of history, the first historian. His great work is literally entitled The Histories. And through numerous examples, Herodotus illustrates that for ancient societies, whether we are talking about the Persians or the Scythians or the Greeks or pretty much anyone else, for them, the question of society, the question of nation, was first and foremost a question of kinship. So we have familial bonds that are then extended to form a tribal bond, and then those bonds are extended even more to an entire ethnic group or even race. And Herodotus quotes Athenian leaders who pledged to defend the Greek people from the Persians. The Athenians recognized the Greeks as, quote, according to Herodotus, quote, one race, speaking one language, with temples to the gods and religious rites in common, and with a common way of life, end quote. So nation, according to the Athenians and according to Herodotus himself, who devised this sort of concept of the nation, a nation is something which depends on four tiers, and they are shared blood, shared language, shared religion, and shared customs. Now, this is interesting because it clashes with quite a few modern conceptions of nation. So, for example, for the ancients, a nation is not the same as a country. It is not defined by a landmass or borders, which are often invisible and arbitrary. A nation is not defined by a flag or an anthem. Greece, for the ancient Greeks, was wherever the Greeks lived. And de Rocher gives another example of Xenophon, who is out doing some exploring with his crew, and they come across some land, some unclaimed land, and Xenophon says that this land would make a great addition to Greece, because and then he encourages his crew to settle down on this land, because for them, Greece was wherever the Greeks had settled down, wherever the Greeks lived. And the way that this clashes with modern conceptions is, well, first of all, it clashes with the modern leftist position, you might say, which is that a nation is a question of magic soil, that anyone from any race can be born on certain magic soil and then become a part of the nation, the native nation of that soil, simply for being born there. The most famous example, the most famous country who practiced this idea is, of course, the United States. It's just been disastrous for so many reasons. It's created the phenomenon of anchor babies. It has completely corrupted people's idea of what is a nation, because we see even now there are French people who believe that anyone born in France is French. There are Italians who believe that anyone born on Italian soil is Italian. There are Brits who believe that anyone who is born on Great Britain is British. And not only is this not true according to the laws on the books of those countries, most countries do not follow the United States model. So it's not even true in a legal sense. But more importantly, it's not even true in a biological sense. Of course, a nation is not defined by who happens to be born on a particular bit of land, on this magic soil that, so someone from sub-Saharan Africa is born on French soil, and French soil is determined by these arbitrary invisible borders, and now that person, that sub-Saharan African, is French for the fact of being born within this area of land that we call France. But of course, he has no biological connection to the French tribe, to those tribal bonds of kinship. And this is true for many other European countries that have adopted this Americanism, that this American trutherism, you might say, that, he was born here on the magic soil, so therefore he is now one of our nation. I think the ancients would be very bemused by this. Certainly the ancient Greeks would be very bemused by this. Because the Greeks had an almost scientific conception of nation. They understood that these things derive from blood, from ancestry, from heritage, from genes. Durocher, in later chapters in the book, and we'll get into this eventually, talks about how some Greek city-states, and certainly some Greek philosophers, some Greek leaders of thought, encouraged eugenics because they understood that certain characteristics are passed down through genes. And so they encouraged the best men and women of Greek society to mate and procreate. And that's sort of positive eugenics. And then the Greeks also practiced negative eugenics, most famously the Spartans, by which they would eliminate deformed or defective infants. So we know that the Greeks had quite a profound understanding of these things, more profound than many people of the modern world. You could definitely argue. But it also clashes with some right-wing or center-right concepts of the nation as well. So obviously, nowadays, we know that the right is basically where the left was 10 years ago. And so you might have a lot of blue pill normie conservatives, especially in countries that practice jus solis, like the United States, that practice this idea of if you're born on the soil, you're automatically a citizen, you're automatically a member of the nation, quote unquote. And so, of course, a lot of conservative Americans will say, that someone who's born in America is just American as me. We all bleed red, white, and blue, etc. So I'm not really going to address that. I think if they hold that position, they're just as absurd as the leftists who think that. But outside of that, like I said, most countries don't practice jus solis. They practice jus sanguinis, by blood. Your citizenship depends on your blood. It's something you inherit through ancestry, through a blood tie. So what I wanted to address about sort of right-wing positions is more the right-wing position of modern nationalism. A lot of us call ourselves nationalists. And when we talk about nationalism, it's usually within the framework of the modern concept, the concept which arose probably, around the 19th century, but then especially comes to prominence in the 20th century. And It's a nationalism that is linked to, patriotism, fatherland, motherland, the landmass, the flag, the anthems, all these sorts of things arose in the modern era, national anthems, things like that. And, we had populations, distinct European populations that even spoke different languages, but because they were sort of ethnically similar or lived on a shared landmass, they had to become a nation in order to fight increasingly larger superpowers, Soviet Union, United States, etc. So, of course, over the course of history, as the nation state expands and gets bigger and bigger and swallows up more tribes, well, in order to get them all working together, and in order to especially convince them to take up arms and go and fight and die, often in battle against similar people, against their kin, against their brethren, you have to instill in them this sort of nationalist fervor, this sort of devotion to a landmass, a flag, an anthem, and the causes that those things have created, that have inspired you to fight for. So one example would be like Spain. Spain is a really interesting case of nationalism, but also the paradox of what is really a nation. Because the right wing in Spain is obviously the most nationalist part of Spanish politics, is occupied by Spanish right-wingers, and they are all intensely in favor of a united Spain, united by, for example, you can show your stance on this issue. You can show your support for a united Spain by supporting things like the monarchy, and by wearing a bracelet on your hand of the Spanish flag, the red, yellow, and red color of the Spanish flag. So flags are immensely important in Spain, and you can tell a lot about a person by the flag bracelet that they wear. So if someone is wearing the Spanish flag bracelet, red, yellow, and red, you can be assured that that person is probably center, right, or right wing. And they are in favor of the monarchy, they support the monarchy, and they support a united Spain. Because what is Spain, really? Spain is a collection of autonomous communities, autonomous regions, and each one has their own flag, and each one has quite a lot of autonomy to do their own thing. But the modern Spain has been united by the monarchy and united by the flag. But the separatists have their flag, the Republicans have their flag. Instead of red, yellow, and red, it's red, yellow, and purple. A person wearing that flag, is left-wing and blasphemes the monarchy. And they're probably very anti-Catholic Church. And they obviously are opposed to, the Franco era, and they think that was just the worst thing ever. But anyway, what I was wanting to say about how this plays into right-wing conceptions of nationalism. So Spain has, we talk about shared language, for example. Spain has, I think, 4 official languages. So you have Castellano, Spanish, but then you also have Galician, or in Castellano it's called Gallego, and that's the language of Galicia. You have Basque, which is the native language of Basque country, which has very strange origins. It's not really connected to Indo-European languages at all. We don't really know where it comes from. And also the Basque DNA, the natives of the Basque country, their DNA is also quite interesting. We don't really know where they come from. They're not really connected to the Indo-Europeans as well. That's neither here nor there, though. And then you have Catalan, the language of Catalonia. And as can be expected, all of these different regions have had, to varying degrees of intensity, separatist movements, movements for independence. They don't want to be a part of Spain. Now, as just a sort of matter of fact, that they want independence, that they see themselves not as Spaniards, they see themselves as Catalans, they see themselves as Basque, they see themselves as Galicians. I totally understand that, because fundamentally, that is a nation. They are truly representing the etymological definition of the word nation, and they are embodying certainly the ancient concept of what it means to be a nation. They have a shared blood. They are not the same. The Galicians and the Basques are not the same as the Andalusians. And they have a different language. They have different customs. And of course, the arrival of Christianity means that they might have a shared religion, but prior to Christianity, maybe not. Maybe they even had different religious traditions. And so they don't really complete the 4 tiers that Herodotus gives us, which define a nation. But in the context of modern Spanish politics, the people who want Catalan independence are almost all leftists, and the people who oppose them are all right-wing Spanish nationalists, people who would be, for example, members of the most right-wing, most nationalist party, although it's not really that way, but that would be Vox. So they want a unified Spain. They want a unified Spanish country, but the nations, I don't think they understand the importance of these distinct nations, these distinct tribes, you might even call them. And so they are on the right wing, and they are often demonized as fachas, fascistas, fascist, Nazis, all that sort of thing, because they are deeply passionate about keeping Spain united and being loyal to the monarchy and to the church and to the red, yellow, and red flag. But do these right-wing Spanish nationalists, and we can even say this about other countries like Great Britain, the Scottish independence movement is mostly comprised of pretty cringe leftists, right? But are the Scots really the same as the English? They are similar, but not quite. They were a distinct tribe, and their origins are certainly distinct, and that can be also said of the Welsh and the Cornish and all sorts of the different elements that inhabit those islands. They're very similar, but they are also different in fundamental ways. And so if you look at it from the ancient Greek perspective, if you look at it from Herodotus' perspective, this modern sense of nationalism is actually quite, I think it would bemuse them as well, because it's just, again, it's a unification, it's a nationhood based on very arbitrary things, the flag, the landmass, the borders. And another thing that people on our side might forget or might be loath to remember is that these modern conceptions of nationalism were the first steps towards the globalist world that we detest living in today. Like I said, when these great superpowers arose in the 20th century, the only way you can compete is to form huge nation states. You have to swallow up and sort of forcibly, if necessary, convince similar but again quite different peoples who happen to live on a shared landmass that they are one and the same, and that they have common cause, and that they need to rally around this new flag, and their enemy are these other people over here, which are also quite similar, but they have a different flag and a different royal family, and somehow we're enemies now, and we have to go to war and kill each other. And the only people who benefit from this are the royal families, are the banking class, the ruling class, which are often not connected by blood to the people who they're sending to war. So that was one thing that stuck out to me, was just how we moderns whether we're looking at this from the modern day progressive side of magic soil and open borders, and we're all one human race, right? That's mistaken. But then also some of the right-wing perspectives are mistaken as well. And we have been living in the paradigm of the nation state and these big superpowers for such a long time that it's difficult to remember that it wasn't always so. And certainly there have been other conceptions of what it means to be a nation. And we're seeing how this plays out even now. Not to be too sort of swept up and constrained by current events, but this is a video which I'm recording during the Russian and Ukrainian conflict. And we can see how absurd modern conceptions of nationhood are, because on the one hand, we have the accusation of Nazi being thrown around, that the Russians are Nazis, and the Russians are saying that the Ukrainian nationalists are Nazis, and Putin says they're going to come in and denazify Ukraine, because if you stand up for Ukraine, then you're a Nazi, you're a nationalist, you're a Nazi. And then, we see that a lot of people in the dissident right are arguing about which side to take, because we have a lot of different interests at play, and we despise the ruling class of the global American empire, and we understand that many of the forces at play here are all Zog, but at the same time, we are being a bit manipulated as well by these misconceptions, perhaps you might even say. They're certainly modern conceptions, but you could argue they are misconceptions of what it means to be a nation. Because the Ukrainians are a Slavic people going to war with Russia, another Slavic people. They have some of those four tiers in common that Herodotus provides, and they are going to war and killing each other in the interests of people that really don't have much to do with those tribal Slavic identities, and certainly don't care to see more white Europeans killing each other in their interests. And then, in the case of Russia, Russia is this massive landmass, it's this massive country that has swallowed up a lot of different identities. Certainly during the Soviet Union, this happened as well. They swallowed up a lot of different nations, different tribes, and now they are all Russian because of their citizenship to the Russian nation state. But the ethnic Russians are becoming a minority in Russia, and they are the ones who are the most related to the Ukrainians, the ethnic Ukrainians, and they are killing each other. For what? So it's all very, very convoluted. And so that gets me to this, the second theme that Durocher talks about and that Herodotus presents us with, which is the theme of Hellenic unity, and how did unity arise in an ancient world, and in particular in the ancient Greek world. And so going back to the themes of the Iliad, Herodotus also documents the cyclical nature of civilizations and how they lose their vigor and the discipline which helped them rise to become a great nation in the first place. And Durocher reminds us moderns that civilizations which we would call advanced many times throughout history were defeated and even conquered by civilizations which were maybe a bit more barbaric, a bit more savage, had more of that vital barbarism that we talked about in the first part. And he gives us examples of how decadent and luxurious and effeminate civilizations fell to the savagery and the vital barbarism of the Vikings and the Mongols and the Germanic tribes. So we have it's a concept that's very difficult for us to imagine nowadays, that how could small, barbaric, primitive tribes take on and defeat and even conquer super advanced and powerful empirical civilizations. But Durocher says that, quote, for the Greeks, freedom was synonymous with the manly virtue necessary to secure it against hostile powers. And so we have a situation where the Greeks realized that in order to defend what they had created, you had to never forget that masculine barbarism. And when they were presented with a threat, with a hostile power, the Greeks then, in that situation, realized that they had to come together. They had, even though these different city-states and different Hellenic tribes, whether we're talking about the Athenians or the Spartans or the Ionians, and there's many more, when they were presented with an external threat, a hostile power, the Greeks realized that their only option for surviving, the only option to stay free, and later we'll talk about the Greek concept of being free, they understood that they had to come together based on their shared Hellenic identity, their shared Hellenic blood, their shared Hellenic religion, their shared Hellenic customs, and their shared Hellenic language. And those were the 4 criteria on which they based their unity. And if they didn't do that, they knew that they would be overrun. So the paradox that we're presented with is, in order to truly be a nation, you have to have these rather limiting criteria. And it is a question of blood. And it is a question of kinship. And, Durocher talks about how in the past, in the ancient world, there was much more tolerance, actually, politically. Many different forms of government were tolerated. And certainly the ancient Greeks, some practiced monarchy, some practiced democracy, some practiced a sort of militant aristocracy. And that was fine. No one was going to war over their political systems and trying to impose their political systems on another tribe. But they were often going to war with each other, mainly for resources or because of past grudges, more often than not. And so we have this sort of the first paradox, which is a nation is this small, exclusive thing, very exclusive, to truly be a nation. But throughout many times, in many occasions, in order to preserve the nation, in order to safeguard the nation from especially external threats, the nation has to expand. The nation has to extend that kinship to competitors and even to members of different tribes that might not fulfill all 4 of Herodotus's criteria. So, for example, we were talking about Great Britain earlier, the British. The Scottish, the Welsh, and the English aren't exactly the same blood. They are very similar, but they aren't exactly the same, and they have had many conflicts because of those differences, and they don't always have the same customs or the same religion. The Celtic populations of Wales and Scotland and Ireland didn't have the same religion or the same customs as the Germanic tribes that formed the English nation. And but then, as we get into the modern age, those competing tribes come together and form the United Kingdom. They form the British people. They are now the British. They have a British flag, but I think there is something that we can look to in Britain and see that maybe they did this a bit right, because the Welsh still maintain their identity, as much as you can nowadays. I know that lots of things are paused, but there is still such a thing as Welsh identity and Scottish identity and Irish identity. And these things are still the embers of these traditional identities and these traditional nations are still burning. But when it comes time to work together for a common cause, Mosley, for example, Oswald Mosley talked about this a lot, that they had to come together as Europeans and come together as British people and see that we are brothers and that we have common cause and that we shouldn't be going to war and killing each other for the interests of people who are not of our tribe or our kin or our ethnic, and then even expanding it to the greatest category, the most ample category of our racial group. So it's this interesting paradox, and we see it play out in the ancient world, in ancient Greece, especially during the Greek and Persian wars. So we have the ethnically united Hellenes, the ethnically united Greeks, coming together, fighting against what Herodotus called a confused mass of soldiers, with all the different peoples and tribes indiscriminately mixed up together. And he's referring to the vast Persian army. So Persia is this great empire, huge empire compared to the Greeks. And they have swallowed up a lot of different peoples and incorporated them into their army. And they're all just mixed up together. And you compare that, you contrast that with the ancient Greeks, who, although they form different tribes with different names and they have different political systems, at the end of the day, they recognized that they were Greek. They had an ethnic unity, and they came together as Greeks to fight this existential threat. And, this recalls the theme that is talked about in the Iliad. So we mentioned how these foundational myths, how they play out in the real world. And in the Iliad, there is this theme of the united, homogeneous Achaeans versus the army of Troy, with its multicultural mercenaries, really. And we see how the Iliad, which was such a fundamental work, such a fundamental mythos for the ancient Greeks, reminded them that unity is your strength, and you need to unite in order to survive and defend your freedoms from external hostile powers. And so then we get to this concept of Pan-Hellenism, and it's how it fostered identity and solidarity. And so, like we mentioned earlier, the Athenians promised to fight alongside the Spartans in the name of defending all the Greek people. So we know that the Greeks, the Athenians, the Spartans, we know that the ancient Greeks, when it was time, they were capable of seeing themselves as a common people, as a racial group, as an ethnic group. And this is important to note that Pan-Hellenism wasn't something that was just restricted to the time during the war. There were moments when the Hellenes faced threats that served to tighten these bonds, but Herodotus and Plato and others often bemoan intra-Hellenic conflict, and they call it civil war. Anytime that these Greek city-states would go to war with each other, in the eyes of Plato, in the eyes of Herodotus, these were civil wars. And they were very disappointed to see these things come about. They were not in favor of these sorts of conflicts because of the damage that they did to the Greek tribe, the Greek ethnicity. And, when the Athenians promised the Spartans that they would fight alongside them, they did so because, and this is again quoting from Herodotus, the Athenians stated that, quote, "we are all Greeks, one race." So we know that they had these sentiments, and there were various times where, in moments of war, with an external force, these bonds were tightened. And in other moments, when the unity wasn't really there, and they would go to war with each other, there were still voices like that of Plato, saying that this is horrible, this is an abomination, this is civil war. What are we doing? This is fratricide. And then, as we come to the age of Alexander, we see that this sort of pan-Hellenistic idea comes back, and Alexander uses it to unite the Hellenes, the Greeks, in his great conquests of the known world at that time. And but yeah, it is particularly during the Persian War that this concept carries a lot of weight, this concept of pan-Hellenism, united Greeks. And it sometimes looks like, if you take an epic view of history, that the Greeks come together and they fight the Persians and they win because of their unity. But it's not quite that simple. And there were a lot of times, including during times of existential exterior threats, that the Greeks didn't really unite fully, and they didn't really get along fully. And I just thought that this had so many parallels with today's Europeans and today's nations, because the pan-Hellenic unity was often undone by begrudging Greeks. And Durocher mentions the Ionians, who would often fight on the Persian side, and they are sort of derided as like the weakest link in the Greek chain. They are described as being, perfect slave people. They're not. They don't have that same manly, masculine vigor and sense of honor that the Spartans and the Athenians have. And then, aside from that sort of weak link amongst the ancient Greeks, they were also undone by petty political differences, by ego, by short-sighted self-interest. They often sort of, you would have a Spartan who didn't want to give up the leadership of command, didn't trust an Athenian to take up the leadership. They wanted glory for themselves. They wanted to have more of the acclaim for themselves. And I think we can see how that plays out in all throughout the ages, that this is something that has always and always will plague just the human condition, and will often undermine attempts at unity and common cause. And so it really speaks to the importance of great leadership, and how you can have unified people, you can have unifying ideology, you can have unifying customs, and you can even have an external threat encroaching and placing those people in great danger. But without quality leadership, it's hopeless. If you have leaders who are petty and who are bickering and who are egotistical and short-sighted, you can have all of the unity in the world and you can have all the common cause in the world, but you will still suffer defeat. And so, happily for the Greeks, when it mattered the most, the Athenians and the Spartans especially came together. And they came together, even though they were immense rivals, but they came together based on those 4 criteria that Herodotus gives us. They came together as Greeks, and they won the day. But that was actually a rare occurrence. And so we need to keep that in mind, how rare this is, how difficult it is to pull this off. And, also, to be fair to the Greeks, they had several obstacles of the age in their way. They didn't have telecommunications, for example, which would have enabled them to definitely get everyone on the same page and get the message out there. And although you could say that telecommunications can be a double-edged sword, and we look at how social media has atomized and isolated and divided us, and everyone is off in their little echo chambers. So it could be a double-edged sword, but certainly the inability to be in constant communication and forge a message together that everyone could be on board with probably lent itself to Greeks of that time being a bit more divided, stubbornly so, hopelessly so, because it was just that much more difficult to get everyone on the same side. But even so, I think there are just still many parallels. Even if you remove the technological aspect, there are still a lot of parallels with ancient Greeks and the modern European situation. And it is a paradoxical situation because certainly, Europeans are facing an external threat, and our nations are in a very precarious position right now. And, when they are erasing Europeans from our own histories and our own mythologies and our own fantasies, they're not doing that because of our Christian identity or because of an English identity or because of a French identity. They are targeting specifically, precisely, European identity. It isn't just Little John or The Lord of the Rings or Lancelot who are being blackwashed. It's also Joan of Arc. It's also Achilles. It's also Julius Caesar. It isn't just great works of English literature like The Lord of the Rings that are being targeted for subversion. It's also Norse mythology. So we see that our enemies see us as a united bloc. Our enemies see us as a homogeneous racial group. They see our bonds of kinship as extending not just to family, but also then to the tribe, and then from the tribe to an entire ethnic group, and then even to the entire racial group. Our enemies are coming after us as a race. And yet we sometimes still see ourselves as disparate peoples. But the paradox is that we need to still do that. To be truly nationalists in the Greek sense, in the sense of Herodotus, I think it is fundamental that we still see ourselves and try to maintain our tribal identities. And so, how do you navigate this? How do you stave off hostile powers, external threats that are coming for you based on your racial identity, not on your religious identity, and not on your ethnic identity, your tribal identity, but your grand racial identity? And this is often a topic that's fraught with disagreement, because I've often argued for pan-European solidarity and pan-European unity, and would get a lot of pushback, which often surprised me. I would get such intense pushback if I would talk about this with other, fellow travelers in this movement. And they would say, an Englishman might say, well, what common cause do I have with Pavel the Pole, who, lives in my landmass, lives in my country, and I don't really want him here either. When that Englishman says clear them out, he's not just talking about the Pakistani grooming gangs and the Hindus running around with machetes, but he's also talking about the Eastern Europeans, the Spaniards, the Mediterraneans who've all come to London, to England, looking for a job, and it's difficult to disagree. It's easy to see where these people are coming from. What do they have in common with Pavel from Poland or Sergio from Spain? An Englishman, what does he have in common with these people? And in an ideal world, a country like England, a nation like the English wouldn't have to be putting up with so much intrusion from so many other peoples from all over the world, both other parts of Europe and the Third World, Africa, Asia, etc. And yes, and this is why these multicultural societies and these extremely diverse multi-ethnic societies are horrible, because they are so dysfunctional and they do create such divisions. And the people who cause this, who bring this about, know this, and they do it intentionally, because of course now it is that much more difficult for the English to unite, and it is that much more difficult for the ethnic Europeans to unite, because now we're all squabbling amongst ourselves in our own lands, because of course the modern concept of nationalism, is basically your get out of my landmass, and you don't even speak my language. So, this is that paradox, is that we're being attacked for our race, which is such an all-encompassing category, and yet that is exactly how we need to see ourselves in order to survive, in order to fight back. But yet, if we do that, we will lose the fundamental elements of what does it actually mean to be a nation. And so I think part of the solution to this problem lies in the way the Greeks looked at it, which was simply very pragmatic. The Persians are coming. They're going to overrun all of us, whether we are Spartan, Athenian, Ionian. They're going to overrun all of us. So we need to come together if we don't want to be slaves to the Persians. But once that threat was extinguished, once that threat was dealt with, they went right back to bickering amongst themselves and seeing themselves as different tribes. So, I think perhaps the ideal way of looking at this would be to say, Englishman, Frenchman, Italian, Swede, German, we're all under attack because we are European, not because we are Christian, not because we are German, not because we are Swedes, but because we are European. So as long as that is the criteria for our destruction, the fact that we are European, we need to unite based on that criteria and fight together based on that. And then when we drive back the enemy, we can go back to bickering amongst ourselves. But I don't even think we have to go back to bickering amongst ourselves. We just need to see that, to revolt against the modern world truly, and to truly return, isn't to defend modern nation states. It's to defend our tribal identities. And, it gets a bit complicated too, because, someone like me, who is of Welsh, Irish, and Italian descent, what is my tribe? What is my kinship? What is my small clan that I could be a part of? So I think even, going forward, we might have to imagine a world in which new terms are invented, new categories of tribes, of ethnicities are devised, because it's going to be, it's a bit more complicated than just I'm English or I'm German. Now there might be people who have a German father, but they have a Croatian mother, or someone has an Italian father, but they have a Welsh mother. What is their tribe? What is their identity? So I think what I took away from this particular segment of the book was how much easier it was in the ancient times to form a tribe and to know your tribe, know your family and your kin and your ancestors, and how complicated things have gotten in the modern world. And of course, I took away just how silly some of the modern, very indulgent positions are on these things, like the magic soil position is obviously just such a modern stupidity. But then also there is the trap on the right to fall into modern conceptions of nation states, and that I'm a nationalist, so I defend what's good for my nation state, even though my entire race is being threatened with extinction. I'm still gonna only focus, like the short-sighted, egotistical, poor leaders of the ancient Greeks. I'm only going to focus on the short-sighted goals, my own egotistical objectives, rather than looking at the big picture of racial survival, European survival. And I also think that it was interesting how this Russian-Ukrainian situation has played out, and how if we had a more ancient Greek mindset, perhaps we wouldn't see two Slavic peoples going to war with each other for the interests of, in one case, a puppet government who's not even of that exact tribal identity, and then on the other hand, a globalist, but from another side, globalist from the east instead of from the west, with similar globalist objectives, empirical objectives. And so in both cases, we're sort of caught in this paradox. We're sort of caught in this, rock and a hard place. Well, what do we do then? Because you want to defend your homeland, you want to defend your country from people who are imposing themselves on it. Then on the other hand, you want to fight against the subversion and the decadence and the evil of NATO and the United States, the US regime. And we sort of we can see that there's a lot of confusion, and there's a lot of energy that's being directed towards dead ends, quite literally dead ends, which is a huge shame. So anyway, that was the main sort of things I took away from this part of the book. And I would say that, for me personally, I would like to see, just as Pan-Hellenism saved the Greeks from the Persians, I would like to see Pan-European solidarity. I would like to see more Europeans realizing that they are under an existential threat. And it's okay to come together as a race. It's okay to find common cause. An Englishman with a German with a Frenchman with a Spaniard. We do have common cause because they are coming for all of us. And, Oswald Mosley spoke about this rather brilliantly and profoundly. And many others have also talked about this. But we should also be careful not to let ideas of pan-European solidarity expand so much, become this sort of Frankenstein monster where we create these massive nation states that do sort of undermine and erase tribal, ethnic traditions and identities and customs. And I think we have lost a lot of that, obviously because of sort of leftist globalism, if you might want to call it that, but also the globalism of the right, the globalism of the nation state, which has, like I said, for example, in the case of Spain, in the case of Great Britain, in the case of Germany, it has sort of consumed and then erased old identities, old tribal identities, and just replaced it with, flag waving. And I don't know if that's such a good place to be in, but it's definitely one of those paradoxes of the modern world. So Anyway, those are my thoughts on this particular part of the book. There will be one more part where we talk about how Greeks looked at the position of authority and the question of freedom. So that will be part 3. Stay tuned for that, and I will see you all next time. Bye.